Om Pramadena Nasandeyaha Kim Karishyami Vrittiman Udpadyanye Vilayante Budbudascha Yata Jale Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Ignorance is not real. Darkness has no substance. Therefore, what does a yogi do with his mind and its projections? He allows them to rise naturally and spontaneously, then dissolves them back at the end of the day like bubbles into water. May Brahman protect us, may Brahman sustain us, and may Brahman illumine our thinking process. May we not find fault with each other, with the world, and with the teachings. And may what we study be a source of inspiration to us eternally. Om peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat. We find ourselves at the beginning of another class series. We ended up with the final class, which I think was 9 classes long, on the subject of qualification in Sanatana Dharma. And we ended up with Advaita Vedanta, looking at it as if it were a darshana. It's actually much more than a darshana, but we looked at, as if you remember, and you can look back on these classes, you looked back at Samkhya, at Patanjali's yoga, at Vedanta, and Tantra, and Kundalini yoga, Vishishtha's yoga, and then we ended up, did I say Sankhya? Then we ended up with the final arm of Divine Mother's 10 arms on that chart we looked at, and saw that Advaita Vedanta was yet to be looked at. So there were some bullet points there we took up. And that actually segues very nicely into the beginning of this class series, which we're going to embark on today, that has to do with non-duality or Advaita. And we're going to take the Gyanamritam Stotram. It's actually verse 3 through 42 of the Avadhuta Gita, which is a non-dual revealed scripture. So since that's 40 verses, I'm calling it a Chalisa. So I've given it several names, actually, because it ends with the refrain, like the sky. I am like the sky. Gagano pamoham. Then we can call it like the sky stotram, or we could call it the Gyanamritam stotram, because its final refrain is Gyamamritam samarasam, this supreme bliss, Gagano pamoham. And so 40 verses is a Chalisa, and there are several beautiful Chalisas in our tradition. So here we're adding another one, only of the non-dual variety in Advaita Vedanta. And a lot of this has to do with maybe clarifying and correcting some of the views that we have had over hundreds, maybe several thousand years, particularly in the West, or around the nature of divine reality. Basically, because we've been looking at it as a changing verity when it's changeless. That is, it's immutable and constant. It doesn't come and go. It's not born, nor does it die. You go on with teachings like that in the non-dual tradition. And it's also a create, which is the main word we want to use for this. It's the very first word of this stotram, actually, that I will sing verses on and then comment on. Some of you into Portland Ashram in Oregon over the last year that is, remember that I appeared twice and sang the stotram, certain verses of it, and then gave commentaries on it using these teaching charts. And so we never made it through all of that, but this is a possibility, depending on how many classes we'll have in this series, of singing the entire stotram, a few verses every Sunday, and then seeing where it leads as far as the teachings of Advaita Vedanta, thereby, as I say, schooling us or reschooling us in the nature of divine reality according to India's seers. This particular scripture, the Avadhuta Gita, the Avadhuta is a kind of holy being who focuses in on non-dual reality. So not a dualist, not a qualified non-dualist necessarily, more like a yogi, as I just chanted about. What does a being like that do with the mental projections that come into his mind? So what we should all do is, when things come up during the day, just let them rise, observe them, and then consciously dissolve them back into the mind from which they came at the end of the day, like bubbles into water. It's a really beautiful sloka that I've extracted from the Ashtavakra Samhita, which is another, almost a pair. These two scriptures, revealed scriptures, are called Avadhuta Gita, Ashtavakra Samhita. We know about the Ashtavakra Samhita that it was the only book that Sri Ramakrishna kept near him, the only one he probably needed, if he needed it at all, with his high realization in Nirvikalpa Samadhi. But we know that he recommended that Narendra, that is the young Swami Vivekananda, read that out loud to him when he was a teenager, sort of like Vishishta and Ram being a divine couple, so were Sri Ramakrishna and Narendranath. And so Swamiji read this, and he was not in that lifetime yet aware of the profundity and depth of non-duality or Advaita Vedanta. And at first he was a little put off by this starkness of the direct statement, because like all of us, we see the world, we see plants, we see objects, we see planets in space and thousands of suns. And it's going to be very difficult for us to say, well, all of that is an illusion or a mirage or a dream or not real, or maybe it would be easier to approach it by saying it's constantly changing. And then if you go to the rules of thumb of Advaita Vedanta, you know that Brahman does not change. So if you're looking at changing things then, and you're taking that to be Brahman or reality, then there must be something missing in your figuring, in your philosophy. And I'll look at that, what I'm calling today Frankenstein philosophy. I'll show you some of that as we get a little bit of a laugh at it, at what we've been believing for so long, and which India would always clarify for us if we want to or able to refer to their rishis, to their seers, especially the ancient ones. It shows how long-lived this idea or this truth, this axiom, this principle of Advaita Vedanta has been present in Indian thinking, all the way up to Buddha, and all the way then some 1200 years past Lord Buddha to Shankara and Gaudapada. And then we find it reemerging here in this day and age through the advent of Sri Ramakrishna and his divine consort, Mother Kali, that is Mother Sharada, and also then his profound student, Swami Vivekananda, whom I just mentioned, got his first taste of that when he read the Ashtavakra Samhita when he was very young. So again, to clarify this, we're drawing these 40 verses out of the Avadhuta Gita and calling it a Chalisa. I've put it into some sort of very simple music so it can be chanted like they used to chant these slokas. And then we can look into what is implied by these beautiful statements that the Avadhuta has made. Avadhuta is a very unique being amongst realized souls. There are different sects of them. Some of them they go about naked in India, so they have no clothes. They call them clothed in the sky, Digambaris. So whatever the case, there are different sects of Avadhuts, but some of these Avadhuts are very strict in their demeanor and in their behavior. And although they're beyond conventions of religion and customs of races and so forth, they live a very free lifestyle. You can see how they got there by considering the depth of the statements that are coming from them all the time, like some of the ones I'll help you make here first. I think to get started in it, that I want to read from a quote from Swami Vivekananda that he put in his letters, because this will kind of introduce this new chart that I put together just last night into the late hours, because I got an idea for it. And this was the first class of this series on Avadhuta Gita. So we definitely want to be introduced into this idea of the acreate. It was a word that Swami Vivekananda coined when he was here in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He came twice to the West. And so when he saw us under the press of creationism and creation theories, then he felt sorry for us that we hadn't yet penetrated into the truth that you can't create something out of nothing, and that something always exists behind what you're going to bring forth. So this brings up actually on this chart 3 different categories that we want to look at, which I'll point out to you soon. So, but first let me read this quote that something that he spoke while he was here that will segue us right nicely into the teachings on this chart. He said, "Sober-minded beings have become disgusted with their superstitious religions and are looking to India for a new light. How eagerly they take in any little bit of the grand thoughts of the holy Vedas, which resist and are unharmed by the terrible onslaughts of modern science. The theories of creation out of nothing, a created soul, of the big tyrant of a god sitting on a throne in a place called heaven, and of eternal hellfires, have disgusted the educated. And the noble thoughts of the Vedas and Upanishads about the eternity of creation and of the soul, they are imbibing fast in one shape or another," unquote. So he puts four points there about the nature of reality and how we've been looking towards creation as being something real, and as God being something separate from us, also as being a fact. But the Avadhut and beings like him, as you can see, are going to propose something entirely different to us in this non-dualistic philosophy called Advaita Vedanta. So let me call up this chart, which you are about to see, and we can put it on the screen so you can see what I call here, with a little bit of humor, a Frankensteinian philosophy. So I had one of the young students of SRV, I told this person what I wanted to have drawn, and so I just make a big tyrant of a god sitting on a cloud in the sky, just to follow Swamiji's quote, and have him have some charge coming out of his hand, and he's giving an incantation, and then poof, all of a sudden the soul gets created out of nothing, and there it is, a winged human, kind of a spiritual Frankenstein, if you will. And then, as if our soul was somehow created out of nothing, or out of something inferior, what Gaudapada calls in his Karaka artificial means. They think that the soul can be created out of artificial means. But the truth is that the soul is consciousness, and consciousness is Brahman. So there's no difference between the consciousness of the apparently individualized soul and the supreme soul. Consciousness is the common denominator, if you will, or the essential substance that underlies all of creation, if you want to use the word creation. That's another thing that we'll look at here, is this idea that I just quoted from the Ashtavakra Samhita, is that what does the yogi do with his sankalpas, that is his mental projections? So it's mental projection that's going on here. And so you see then the title of this chart is The Myth of Creation. And ajati is what would be called non-birth, non-death, or non-creation. We're using the word acreate. So that comes forth right away. And you can see the three categories of this chart underneath. First, we'll take in the teachings of what I call these pithy points to ponder about the soul, or the Atman, being acreate. And then in the second category, or column, box there, the myth of creation is actually mental projection. So we're going to change this idea of something being created out of nothing into the idea of it being projected by the mind, and also, by the way, withdrawn by the mind. And so we're going to replace the ideas of birth and death with projection and withdrawal. And then as far as birth and life and death, we're going to replace the word life with eternal life. That's because the soul is never born and never dies, so it lives eternally. It is consciousness. And so we'll look at some of the correcting ideas about changing, of recognizing this myth that we've been studying and we've been taking to be real in religion, and change it to what the seers have seen as the truth, that it's really unchanging reality. And then when the mind enters into waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, it is under the cloud of unknowing. And that's where it begins to misconceive of its true nature and forget its true nature. And that forgetfulness is called suffering. So if you start at suffering and go backwards, then you'll see how suffering is caused, much like the Four Noble Truths of Lord Buddha. But in this way, you're tracing it back to something that Gaudapada said Buddha never taught. And that's this eternal nature of the soul, and how it's acreate, that creation is a myth, basically. It's just a projection of the mind, like a dream you're having. So this is going to give some validity to these words they use sometimes that confuse us, like basically dream or illusion. If we come closer to it, it's a mental projection, and then it also gets withdrawn. And when a thing gets projected and withdrawn, it's not being created out of nothing, thus being born, and it's not being destroyed at the end, thus not dying. And so all of this is going to get a treatment by the Avatut. So the third category over here is all things are unoriginated. So when you take up the non-dual view of the great souls, the great Advaitins, they're not just relegating this to the soul is unoriginated, that is, has no origination, ajati, that it's eternal, it doesn't have any beginning, middle, and end. They're going to extend this into all things. The temptation is always to say all created things, you see, because that's what we're in the habit of doing, but it's all projected things of the mind. Since they come from the mind, then they rise in the mind sees them, and they dissolve back into the mind. No one has ever seen anything, Gaudapada says, that isn't of the mind. So everything is born out of the mind, lives in the mind witnesses it in the mind, and the mind then dissolves back into the mind, and the mind is being observed by the Atman. And when the Atman ventures away from, when the mind ventures away from the Atman and becomes Buddha Vritte, or it begins to Vrittiman, as I just chanted, Pramadina na sandeha kim karishami Vrittiman, man, mind, Vritti, vibration. When it starts to vibrate away from its center, it enters into waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. And there's the connection that is not being made in religion or philosophy that these three states that are upon you are actually Maya. They're unreal, they're veils. He calls them smoke in the first verse. So let's sing the first verse so we can have the introduction here and look at these verses as they come up one at a time. I think I'm going to sing three because that's how many I want to try and work on today. Nirmula mula rahito hisado dito ham Nirtuma duma rahito hisado dito ham Nirdipa dipa rahito hisado dito ham Gyanamritam Samarasam Gaganopamoham Nishkama Kamam Miha Namakatam Vadami Nisanga Sangam Miha Namakatam Vadami Nisara Sara Rahitam Katam vadami Gyanamritam Samarasam Gaganopamoham Advaita Rupam Akilam Hikatam vadami Dvaitam Swarupam Akilam Hikatam vadami Nicham tvanicham akilam hikatam vadami Gyanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham Gyanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham So we have made a start then, penetrated into the first three verses of what the Avadhut has to tell us. And he starts out saying, Nirmula mula rahito hi sado dipoham. So Nirmula, here's what I don't really always recommend that people use different versions of the same scripture. You know me, I say find a good Gita and stick with it. Don't get into, different variations or arguing about or thinking, comparing. I mean, that can have a certain interest and can go only so far, but it sort of stops short of understanding the depth of a sloka or a sutra in the way that a certain teacher has put it forth. So in that way, in a sense, I'll break through that a little bit, my own rule here, and I've looked into two Swamis of the Ramakrishna order who have put out two versions of the Avadhita Gita. One of them even has a picture of your guru on the front of it, and the other one is more plain. So basically, this Nirmula Mula, one of the Swamis says acreate. It doesn't have. I don't have roots. I'm a tree without roots, like a tree floating in space. So you took it away from Earth, and it's just a tree, and it's floating in space, and its roots are not connected to Earth. So this is what it pretty much means: mula, root, base. So he says, Nirmula mula. I don't have that base. Maybe I should just really read it to you because that will make it clearer. He says here, I am devoid of root and rootlessness, and I am ever manifest. I am devoid of smoke and spokelessness, and I am ever manifest. I am devoid of light and the absence of light, and am ever manifest. And then Gyanamritam Samarasam Gagonopamoham. I am the nectar of knowledge, homogeneous existence, like the sky. So there is nothing here on earth that can describe Brahman. No words, no analogy, no metaphor. So what have they tried to do? Well, let's try the ocean. Okay, so, well, we'll use the ocean for our meditation. But you see, it always has waves, and it has things in it that move and change. So, oh, well, the ocean is decent, but it's not really very adequate for describing Brahman. Let's now try the sun. Now we look at the sun, and oh, it's beautiful. It sheds light. So it's good for that. But basically, it's got all sorts of changes on its surface. Sun flares and sunspots, and you name it, it's constantly in flux and in change. So if you look closely at it, it's not going to be very good. Then you come to the moon. It's got dark spots on it, Holy Mother said, and so forth. So what else can we take up? So he's taking up the sky, like I think he means ether, really, because ether is not affected by the objects that are in it. Ether will, unlike air, sky, if you say sky, then you could use the analogy of there's oxygen in the sky, you see. But if you, and you could infer that then all these objects are somehow in Brahman through some other medium. So now you look at his use of the sky. I'm indivisible like the sky. So this indivisible ether. However, you could see that the seers saw into 5 different kinds of ether: a physical ether, an ether of energy, an ether of thought, an ether of mind, and an ether of spirituality or consciousness. So there are 5 different ethers inside of that. So I don't have to take this apart for you again to illustrate that, because there are 4 little dolls inside of this one big doll. And so that's a teaching about the 5 ethers. At least India would take it to be a teaching of the 5 ethers, how one lays inside of the other. My point being that it's not going to describe Brahman very well, because Brahman doesn't have sheaths, coverings, and it's ever free from these things. So he's saying that here in this sloka. Let's see what the other Swami has mentioned here. He goes more towards that word that Swami Vivekananda coined. He says, I am uncreated, I am separate from creation, for I am ever present. I am unclouded and free from the cloud of Maya, for I am always manifest. I do not borrow light from another light, and I am also separate from the luminous objects, for I am self-luminous. I am existence, knowledge, bliss, as boundless as space. So you could see one used sky, one used space, and one is using the idea of smoke, and the other is using the idea of clouds. Well, that's next big. Nir Duma Duma Rahito Hi Sadhu Dipaham. Duma is really ash or smoke. There's Dumavati is actually the goddess of ashes and of smoke. So they're using these Sanskrit words, which are very ancient, to try and communicate to us that they're free of both opposites. They don't have a root in nature. They're separate from nature, as the second commentary says. At the same time, it's not that they're rootless, because they're rooted in Brahman, see. And same with smoke. There's a covering called Avarana Shakti, and there's a distorting power called Vikshepa Shakti. And those 2 are covering powers of Maya, and smoke cannot cloud them. That kind of smoke or clouding cannot affect them. The Avatut sings, instead I'm this boundless sky. So without a basis, without a root anywhere, and without smoke. So this is what he's trying to communicate to us. And as I said, the pithy points to ponder about this first verse. He actually, before I go to them, the next line is Nir Deepa Deepa Rahito Hi Sadho Deepoham, Sadho Ditoham. Nir Deepa, of course, you know, Deepa means light. So one of the commentators here said that actually, I'm not light, nor am the absence of light. So in non-duality, you see, you can't just like go for formlessness and leave form alone. That's a problem in meditation. That's a problem that philosophers have had. That's a problem that people have when they want to try and seek a higher truth, or they've actually had an experience where the senses and objects disappeared for them, like Narendra did when he was young, and Sri Ramakrishna touched him. He saw everything disappear, all objects disappear, and he was just had this experience that the Avatut's trying to communicate to us. So you can't, if you say I'm not devoid of light, but I'm not light either. See, so this is the beauty of non-duality, that it takes you beyond even the subtlemost of dualities. And it can be a little bit confusing for people because they should be trying to raise themselves out of the duality of pleasure and pain, for instance, or good and bad. Good and bad are chains that hold, one of iron, one of gold, as Swami Vivekananda has said. Or virtue and vice. That's a really difficult one for people, particularly in conventional religion, to lift themselves out of, because the soul never sins. So these are some of these superstitions that we've courted, sometimes for thousands of years in conventional religion, and thereby have veiled our third eye from opening and seeing the truth that I and my Father are one, or that this self is Brahman. However you want to put that, it happens in different traditions. And these few things I'm saying about it are an introduction to what the great advices would say about it. So, nirdipa dipa rahito hi saroditoham. I am not light nor the absence of light. However, he says right after that, I'm self-luminous. So he doesn't need to go looking for light because he's got a darkness in him, nor does he have to deny that light is missing, because he is that light, you see. So it brings it all back to this one non-dual truth that's so important to us, that causes these superstitions to die away, superstitions of religion. You begin hearing those truths, and then you begin to contemplate it, and then you cannot go back anymore to conventional ways of thinking. You're freed from all of those limitations. And by the way, you're probably going to be free from things like earth, fire, air, water, ether, tasting, touching, hearing, smelling, and seeing, and the mind's thinking, because we're going to find out, as this chart says, that the myth of creation really is mental projection. So when you say creation to an Advaitist, or to even a Vishishta Advaitist in India, they're kind of thinking, well, tongue in cheek, I understand what you mean. There's this apparent creation out there, and you're thinking that some God created it and put you there, like, from a cloud on high, and zapped you with consciousness all of a sudden that came from who knows where. And you've got a Frankensteinian philosophy going on there that's not going to hold water if you go in front of the Advaitists and start babbling these kinds of things to them. They're going to say, well, we found out something completely different over thousands and thousands of years in our meditations. We lifted ourselves above earth and above the heaven-aspiring senses, quote unquote, Svetashvatara Upanishad, to the feet of the Lord, if you want to put it anthropomorphically, or to this light that has no darkness in it, or to this eternal life that never had a birth and had a death. And that's really what we're getting at when we say ajati, and when Vivekananda coins the word acreate. He wanted us off that idea that, as I just read, that there's some big fellow in the clouds up there, and he's running the show, and he's creating souls. The Advaitists would say, by what? By artificial means, like projection? Okay, I'll give you that. It seems like that's happening. But really, the great mind and the collective mind and the individual mind, which are all one mind, is going through phases of waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, and that's where souls enter into darkness. They enter into dream, a kind of mass collective mental dreaming that then veils their consciousness of this underlying foundation, the eternal substratum. Even Meister Eckhart, a Christian mystic, came upon that and coined that phrase. So let's maybe with that first verse taken apart, look at a few of these pithy points, because it puts it in a way that's very, in the time that we have here for this first class, a very direct way according to the Advaita Vedanta. So we're talking about soul. We're going to call it Atman, or we're going to capitalize it. Small soul, sometimes that's a soul that dreams. It's transmigrating from heaven to earth to El. It's called rebirth. And so that has to be figured into the quotient as a part of the dream. But here, when we talk about uppercase soul with Atman, we're talking about something that's acreate, means it never got created because it's eternal. There was never a beginning to it. It viewed everything from that was in the mind from the standpoint of observer, or what they call witness consciousness, or Sakshibhutam. It witnessed all the phenomena that this thinking mind, when it vibrated, came up with, and that's a lot. When it entered into deep sleep, then with the seeds in deep sleep, started vibrating more densely, started dreaming about them. And then with the dream there, the power of the word in it, the power of projection, it entered back into waking state and brought all of these thoughts of objects into it and turned them into matter, turned them into solid things, or liquid things, or gaseous things. And there all of a sudden, it gave those up and went back into dreaming about them, and then went back to deep sleep where the seeds are. And that happened for cycles and cycles and cycles, hundreds and thousands of times. And souls caught up in samsara. And Buddha called this the Kala Chakra. And samsara was another word for that, or Maya. So under this category, let's read some of these to help convince us. This would be like coffin nails that you can put this idea of creation to death with in your mind, because it's all in your mind that this is happening, and in the minds of people who are proposing fundamentalism and dualism as the reality. How can that be the case? And down here, for instance, might as well start with that quote: creation is duality. Advaita is non-duality. Before creation, no difference between the embodied soul and Brahman ever existed. Difference only pertains to a state yet to come. To regard such a state as being true is irrational. So here we're talking and leaning more towards that illusion of time. We're just talking about it. Samsara, the Kala Chakra, wheels of birth and death in time. And these are all going on in the mind. The births are taking place in time, which is in the mind. Where's the time which the soul will come? And where's the time when the soul will go? When all of time is in the mind. You see, that's how Vivekananda put it. Same with space. Where's the space that the soul will go to? And where's the space that it will vacate when all of space is in the soul? See? So this great soul, the small soul is the mind, and it's dreaming itself from place to place, and it's waking up and dreaming itself again. And that's called the three phases of our consciousness: waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. And they have long cycles, not just 12-hour cycle at night or 24 during the day. These get together and exacerbate. You see, more and more of them pile gloom on top of gloom in ignorance, as Vivekananda has said. So we start out right away with saying consciousness is God, is the eternal substance which is existence. So when you put Satchitananda together, as we were saying in Satsang just yesterday morning, then you have these three great schools of thinking: that God is existence, God is wisdom, non-dual wisdom, and God is ecstatic bliss. So consciousness is God. That would kill a lot of doubts, you see, in the potential philosopher or the person who's trying to understand the nature of truth and reality and gain freedom. These teachings are for people who are looking towards being free of something that's limiting them, like worlds and like bodies, and bodies that suffer, and limited thinking, rational thinking. People find they come up against that wall and can't get past it. The intellectual frame of reference, it's called. So how to find a way outside of that, how to breathe freely, always be restricted by these conditions of Maya, or attended by matter and thought. Another one is consciousness is inherently intelligent, free of beginnings and ends, i.e., free of cycles. Consciousness is innately aware. There is no entity that pre-exists it. And these are all statements from Shankara, Gaudapada, and the Upanishads that they commented on. So no entity that pre-exists it. So it was there in the beginning because there was no beginning, and it's there at the end when there is no end. You see, it puts to death the three phases of time, past, present, and future. They're all happening in it. It's not happening in them. And all work is happening there in nature, and it's not happening in the soul. It's just dreaming this work. If it gets stuck in it, then it gets stuck in the idea that God is active, and also then suffers karma from action. So we're going to a place that's free of all these potential karmas, or these potential problems that are arising in consciousness when the mind-ego complex get a hold of consciousness and starts to enter into waking, dreaming, and deep sleep states with it. That's a conditioning that's very deep. To say that consciousness is innately aware, it means that it doesn't have to go seeking for awareness somewhere like we are. Oh, I think I want to get higher awareness, you see, so we go looking for higher awareness somewhere out there. That if we knew that our consciousness was innately aware, that it is awareness, then that's a non-dual statement that affects the mind entirely different than, again, with having to somehow spring into action and go running away from our source, trying to find something which is already ours. They say this in different ways about Advaita and realization of the Atman. Here's a good one that also is another coffin nail for this idea of creating something out of nothing. Consciousness is not nothing, nor is it something. It is unborn. So you can't create something out of nothing is the way in which we found to explain this. Like the Frankensteinian philosophy up here is like, out of something God created, out of nothing God created something. The soul was not there at all, then all of a sudden it's there. But who can create consciousness? Who can create an innately aware soul? Who can cause intelligence to all of a sudden exist when that is the nature of everything? It's got this consciousness permeating it like sugar, like sweetness in sugarcane juice. It's run through and through. Like the idea of liquidity in water, or heat and fire, or whiteness and snow. That's the nature of the thing, totally permeated by consciousness, without beginning and without end. So you can put it in terms of time, put it in terms of space, you can put it in terms of states of consciousness, and look at it that way, and you should from all sides now. And then hear what the Advaita has said about it. Start changing your thinking around this to find God finally there inside your own self, and all the kingdoms of heaven also there inside your own self. Being beginningless, consciousness existed before the initial thought of creation. So it's not like the Advaitas are saying, there is no creation. It's that that belongs to the mind, not to consciousness. Consciousness doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end to it. It's just like waking up on a road that has no end. You look back, it has no beginning. You look forward, it has no end. You walk on it both ways, you never find an end or a beginning to it. That's the road of consciousness. That's the path where you just finally accept that those dualities and those triputis and those thoughts that the mind is having that conditioned this consciousness to make it look like a road with many turns or many branches, you reject that finally, and you just get on the path of realization, which is knowledge of your own true self, Atma Bodha. Consciousness is anterior to life, mind, thought, time, space, individuation, that means ego, energy, and matter. So we're trying to put there in as many things as intelligent thinking people might come up with when they want to compare or contrast divine reality with relativity. All of these things are a part of relativity. And by the way, that word anterior is nicely used in the Mundaka Upanishad too. Anterior to life and mind is the Atman, it says. So anterior means, of course, prior or before. So if it's prior to life, then there must have been no life somewhere, like some scriptures have said. But they call that a nothingness. And then they're going to try and put God there as something that starts this ball rolling. But God, consciousness, awareness was always there. And these were just appearances that were arising off of it and falling back into it. And they're like waves into the ocean. So you can't take this eternity away from divine reality. You can't take infinity away from divine reality. And you certainly can't take non-dual awareness or pure consciousness away from it. That's, you might say, its secret. The great secrets of non-duality, really, number one is that ajati, there is no origination to anything, as we'll see here soon. And aparinama, there's no change going on that's real. These are like two pillars of Advaita philosophy. Ajati, which we're using here, and it's not ajati, the myth of creation, it's ajati and the myth of creation, so that we separate these two. Ajati, jati means birth, can mean caste and people and cultures and everything. So that's ajati. None of that is in Brahman. It's all in Maya. It's a dream beings in Maya are having using the mind, but that mind can be purified so that it's not mind anymore. And so it's not foisting its projecting power with all of the things that are possible in the mind, which you know are plenty because of the so-called creation that's all around you. You take that away from the mind and render it stripped of all this projecting power, and then it just becomes itself again, pure conscious awareness. And like poison that's in a snake and doesn't kill the snake, this mind is in consciousness, and it doesn't affect or change consciousness whatsoever. So they concentrate on consciousness, beings that are lost and maybe for cycles of time concentrate on change, relativity, things that transform. But acreate means it doesn't have a transformation. It was there at the very outset. So these are different ways in which the advices are trying to tell us that would cover everything: time, space, name, form, mind, energy, matter, thought. Whatever you can look at that's here is all a property of the mind, and consciousness is a witness of that. Yes, mind sleeps too, as we know. You see, so when there's this abeyance of everything, it's pulled back to seeds, and then when vibration comes again, which is basically desire, When desire rises up in the mind to enjoy things again, then that's how it will do it. It will project these worlds of name and form and time and space and create bodies out of itself and begin to play in the fields of the Lord, or sport in consciousness. Some beings are very good at that too. But it doesn't take away what we're trying to point to here, is this non-dual reality. It's the space, like he's saying, it's the sky that exists underneath the fields of the Lord in which beings are playing. See? It's like somebody playing in a field, some children, all of a sudden they see a moon. Oh, how beautiful. All of a sudden their mind's taken completely away from the earth, and it's up there focused on the moon. Like that, the philosopher is thinking, or the meditator is meditating, all of a sudden has this idea that this whole thing that I'm playing with needs to be transcended, that it's just a bunch of vibration in my mind. It's my own sankalpa based in desire. So Holy Mother said, this will be the last time for you that you get rid of, the last lifetime for you when you get rid of desire. And desire can be deeply rooted. It's not like something you can pull out by the roots very easily, like this tree floating in space with no roots, you see. But nonetheless, people who want to be free know that that has to be done. Krishna says so in the Gita. He says, oh, Arjuna, you should know for certain that nobody can become free, a yogi, if they still are under the influence of sankalpa, the mind's desire to project things and then enter into them and play with them. It's like Sri Ramakrishna used to say, when a child, a baby, gets tired of its red toy, it'll throw it away. But before that, you cannot convince it to do that. It won't let go of it. So when the mature soul gets rid of the red toys of everything the mind projected in space and time that has name and form and also suffers cause and effect, karma, and it throws that red toy away, that's when the mother will come to it. See, it starts crying for something that's beyond the projection of its own mind. And then Divine Mother of the Universe shows up with this revelation. So right away, Avarana Shakti, the covering power, dissolves. Right away, Vikshepa Shakti, the distorting power, dissolves. And all of a sudden, Prakasha Shakti comes forth. Here, my son, have this revelation of what's true, see. And if you have any questions about it, go and ask the seers, because they're absolutely certain of it. It's how they live. How else do they live? Put simply, consciousness is free of vibration, unlike thought, energy, and matter. So one of the ways they look to is buddhe vritti, you see. So when the buddhi, the intelligence of the mind, and here's a key for us, stops vibrating, then everything goes into abeyance and is peaceful and quiet. So you have this mind. Is the mind free to do what it wants all the time? Does it say, okay, it's time for waking, dreaming, deep sleep. I'm going to leave Brahman now, and I'm going to get into sportive play. I'm going to get into Maya. I'm going to get into samsaric wheel. And it just does that on its own? Or does the intelligence have something to do with it? See, because consciousness is innate intelligence, and it doesn't fall into those conundrums. People do with their limited intelligence. So when they realize that they can stop things by stopping their intelligence from vibrating, that's perfect meditation. And when they can do that for long enough, that's samadhi. So that's why really they're having you meditate and trying to stop thoughts, because thoughts are vibrations, and vibrations are keeping you in this cycle of birth, life, and death. Call it waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, if you will. So all of these teachings are saying there is no birth, life, and death. There is no waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, except in the mind that's dreaming. And the Atman's always watching this, see. So pretty soon the soul will say, can I just be the witness of all this? and be like the sky. Jnanamritam samarasam gagano pamoham. I am pure conscious awareness. I am Satchidananda, indivisible like ether, boundless like the sky. It's another way of putting that verse. Borrowing from the 5 elements. You see, 2 of them are very subtle. And here's what I've been mentioning already that I jumped the gun. Consciousness witnesses the mind's projecting powers from within itself. It's a very nice way of putting it with Gaudapada's Karika on the Mandukya Upanishad. Consciousness witnesses the mind's projecting powers from within itself. So it'd be like this oversoul. So if you want to make it simpler, there's this man with lots of children, or there's a school teacher watching a playground. So that person's inactive and watching all the children play, knows what everything that's going on and protects them and so forth, but is not participating. So in that way, everything the mind's doing has this ultimately intelligent power of witnessing from the standpoint of being non-attached and non-participatory. That's coming up here too. Also, one of the beautiful things is that it is unborn and unchanging, but that's before that it's adhisthana. That means it's original. It cannot be manufactured artificially. I mentioned that earlier. So if you have this image of God creating a soul somewhere in some cloud somewhere and breathing life into it, as sometimes religion touches, the hand of God comes and touches. We have it in ancient European art, old European art, that God somehow came and touched man and he woke up. But God and man are not 2 different things. When the soul wanted to turn into a form, then it departed from the realm of nameless, formless divinity and took on a form and gave itself a name, and with that form called body, entered into these phases of time and projected itself there and created, that is, projected everything here on its own. That's how powerful the cosmic mind is. They call that Mahat. The Mahat is the cosmic mind. And then they have the collective mind, and the individual mind then comes out of that. So just like in that threefold way, from cosmic to collective to individual, you have from deep sleep to dreaming to waking. You have from formlessness to formless form to form. And everything is proceeding outward like that. But anytime you see it moving, you know that that's the mind that's operating. Mind, ego, intelligence, and its thoughts are in operation, and you must always look to the witness of that. Else, you can go as far as of refining the intellect, and then it can come to the end of its territory, and it will begin to take rationale as the highest of all properties and the highest of all beliefs, and it'll settle itself and conclude there in the intellectual frame of reference that it knows everything, but it hasn't yet known itself, hasn't known consciousness. It's only known a limited, slimmed down version of that, like light run through a series of filters, like a great dome, poet Shelley says, you see, and then light comes and hits that dome with many colored glasses, and it reflects through those colors and turns into all the worlds and all the things in the worlds and all the beings enjoying them. But where did that light that was above the dome of the great mind come from? Or did it come at all? Was it just staying in one stationary place and things were growing on it and disappearing on it? Like my first chant today, what does a yogi do with his projections? He lets them rise naturally. And then at the end of the day, he dissolves them back, like bubbles into water. Buddhist-cha yatsa jale. So he's seen bubbles dissolve into water. He got the idea, maybe I can do that with my thoughts, and I'll just return them to their source, which has an origin, by the way, as it were. See, that's the mind. We're going to get soon, maybe next week, to how all things are unoriginated. And that's a very powerful part of non-dual understanding. And then we're going to look at the myth of creation and how it is really actually synonymous with or one with mental projection. That's what's going on. So the final point here under this category of soul Atman is a-create says, being unborn and unchanging, who or what could possibly produce Atman? Is consciousness produced from something? What would that be? From intelligence? Then where would intelligence come from? It has to be inherent in the thing itself. And then the expressions of it, you see, will come forth like waves from an ocean. The ocean is just still, wind comes forth, world's turning, tides are shifting, then the ocean all of a sudden has these movements on it, like vibrations. Then it returns to the stillness again. So these are beautiful. Some of my favorites there is the idea that comes from Gaudapada against artificially creating a soul somehow. That's that Frankensteinian philosophy. And then I also really like that very much about who could possibly produce a soul or create a soul when a soul is consciousness. See, it's not like a person with a soul who's aware of a soul is walking around and saying, where can I produce another soul? See, or where did my soul come from? They're going to find out that everything came from the soul, but the soul didn't come from everything. See? And Vivekananda has ways of putting that. You're not born from the world is born from you. And that you, by the way, is the mind. So he's taking you halfway into the teachings, but the precious non-dual teaching, parts of the teaching that the advices are giving us here are pithy points to ponder. You see, now you're going to have to take up one of those or more of them and start thinking about it. How can consciousness ever be created? It can't be created out of nothing. It must have been there. It must have been something all along. And another one connection to make is that consciousness is Brahman. See, that you don't say Brahman exists or doesn't exist. I think he said that already, right? Nirmula mula rahito hi sarodhitoham. I don't have a root, nor am I rootless, basically. So the way one of the commentators put that. The other saying, I'm not create, I may create. I don't get created, nor do I get destroyed. It's like Shankara's beautiful Nirvana Shatkam. You know, it says, I never had a birth because I never had a death because I never had a birth. See? So he's going deeply into that from a standpoint of realization of the Atman, being unborn, a-create. So I wanted to use this as the main chart for pretty much a whole series of classes on these verses. We'll take up other charts, but we can always come back to this. When it comes to the rest of this verse, I wanted to look at this line, Nir Tuma Tuma Rahito, how one of the Swamis says, I have, my consciousness is not clouded. Duma means clouds or smoke. I think he uses smoke. He says, I am unclouded and free from the cloud of Maya. So that is one of the commentators says, so This is the word in which we've put together for everything that flummoxes us, everything that confuses the mind, everything that causes it to think that it's a finite being existing in a relative world, and beginning to look at that. And this is, of course, where the idea of bondage comes when Bhagavad is saying, I'm ever free, never bound. We get to many beautiful verses like that. In the Sunday classes to come, we'll sing more of these and see where all of these ideas have come from, out of those beings, those rare beings who have realized Advaita Vedanta. So as far as smoke and smokelessness go, the other commentator, as you heard me read, says, I am devoid of smoke and smokelessness. I am ever manifest. So whether you're talking about smoke or cloud, nirduma, then the idea here is that the mind is somehow, these truths are somehow getting obscured. And the mind's not seeing clearly. It's seeing through a glass darkly, I think is the expression. It's like you had a looking glass and you were looking at something, but the room was dark. What good's that going to do you? See, turn some light on, then use the looking glass. So looking through a glass darkly is what beings have been doing about with their philosophical views or so-called views for hundreds and thousands of years in religion. And in Indian philosophy, we found out that that was stripped clean and free from those kinds of misconceptions. Philosophy at a very high and refined level got into the mix of life and began to produce illumined souls. Jivan Muktas and yogis and avaduts and rishis and on, avatars. So these beings had the great advantage of having their minds cleared of these misconceptions that had begun to gather. Like Shankara saying, I always have to keep the mirror of my mind wiped clean each day like a mirror. So he's saying basically two things at once. One is that I am in charge of this mind, I'm not the mind. Number two is that since I have a mind, I have to keep it wiped clean, because it's through mind that I'm seeing everything here. And I can run afoul of these teachings if I don't keep that mind perfectly clear, and it begins to give me a false reading. Like, for instance, it begins to convince the ego and the intellect that the senses and objects are real. And then consciousness falls, you see, and it begins to suffer. And then it says, why am I suffering? Then it starts to consider suffering to be real. And then it considers sin and sinlessness to be another duality. Virtue and vice is real. And then religion at that point, fundamentalism, is on the march, you see, and whole collections of people are thinking in this unnecessary way when they could use this simple, profound, non-dual truth to inform their minds and clear it of duma, ashes or smoke, you see. Near duma, near means without, or made extent. The smoke of my mind was cleared out, you might say, by the wind of grace, if you're going towards a philosophy that has grace as its ultimate. Or the fog of my mind lifted because the sun of wisdom came up, you see. So whether you use cloud or smoke or fog, this is the implication here. So I was thinking we could, to finish commenting on this verse, and we'll come back to this chart. Don't forget the Frankensteinian philosophy that we're trying to put to death with these coffin nails of Advaitic realization, and start thinking in a new and fresh way again. Let's look how this fog of delusion, this smoke of unclarity, and these ashes of delusion get blown away or taken away by souls who are seeking the truth. So this chart you see here coming before you now will help us make a final commentary on this first verse and part of the second, which we'll take up next week. So cutting through clouds of false superimposition, that's called vivarta, by the way, in Sanskrit. You can see the indispensable role of viveka in spiritual life. So when I just said Shankara keeps wiping clear the mirror of his mind, then he's using this sort of viveka, or this cleaning cloth, as it were, in this analogy, to wipe away the smoke, the fog, the ashes, the dust that covers the mind every day when it goes into states of dreaming, deep sleep, for instance, comes back awake, and it went into dreaming and deep sleep thinking clearly, and it came out with the tamoguna in it. You see, it woke up depressed or heavy, or it woke up excited and restless. So you have to spend the rest of the day getting it back to balance and clarity. I was just talking to somebody who, it's tax time, so this tax person is just working for days and days at a time with hundreds of people trying to do their taxes. And she says it's just, there's no peace of mind. Just she's thinking numbers all day, and then she goes to sleep. She's thinking numbers in her sleep, wakes up again, numbers. So all of this is what's going on. So people complain of this, what you think you are kind of problem. So the mind then needs to be trained to think about divine reality, free and clear of all these trappings. First of all, of suffering. Second of all, the ignorance that causes suffering. Third of all, of the tendency towards desire, which takes you to ignorance, which causes suffering. And then beyond desire, know that sankalpa that the mind's engaging in is caused by desire. And so you should try and become desireless. Here's what we just sang here. Niskama kamam mihana katam vadami nisanga sangam mihanam katam vadami nisarasara rahitam chakatam vadami Gyanamritam samarasam gaganopamoham. Very first line there in the second verse. Did you hear it? Nishkama kaman ihanama katam vadami. Kama is desire. So this, and next is sangha and sangam. That means attachment and non-attachment. And sara and nisara, essence and non-essence. So the Avadhuta is sitting there in his realization with a brilliantly clear mind and completely in knowledge of all these non-dual axioms that have been gleaned by souls before him and around him, because he belongs to a whole community of Avadhutas. And he's saying, well, what does this mean to me? You see, and what can it mean to others if I express it? So he's taking things like our idea in being created, and or we never were created, confusion, or we never were confused, that's smoke. We're seeking light, or there is no light, got rid of that one. Now, desire and no desire, I got rid of that one. Nisanga, sangam, attachment, non-attachment, none of them apply to me anymore. Sara, nisara, essence or non-essence. I'm just pure conscious awareness, indivisible like the sky, boundless like space. So he puts that at the end of every one of these verses. Gyanamritam, nectar, amritam, gyanam, of non-dual wisdom. This nectar I have drunk. Gyanamritam, samarasam. It's the most refined of all nectars. It's called me ras. That's caused me rasam. It's caused me the bliss of knowing the self. This nectar has bubbled up out of my very self, samarasam. Gargano pamaham, and I have then become just like a sky, free of clouds, free of smoke, free of dust, free of ashes, free of desire, free of attachment, or the idea of non-attachment, and free of essence and non-essence. Basically, this is what he's saying in 2 verses. From the depth and profundity of his own realization, every other force, outer and inner, has been taken away. That's over here. Everything outer and internal happened from the mind. So he's beginning to take away external and internal too, because people start to take refuge in the internal. Oh, I've got to give up the external. But now I found out that it's all come from the internal, you see. So now I'm taking refuge in the internal, but that's all part of the mind too. There are inner worlds that the mind created. The great mind is responsible for that. So I'm going to have to make a sojourn through those back to my depths, which is this essence beyond essence and non-essence. This clarity beyond knowing and not knowing. So this is this strand of non-dual perfection that's, that is the only real thread in the fabric. It's the gold thread in a fabric made of different kinds of materials. If you get a hold of it and hold on to that and trace it back, it'll lead you right to the source, which is, how to put it, Advaita, non-dual. So, giving you a sort of consensus of the whole 2 verses right in a row so that we get something accomplished today as far as making our way. As far as what happens to people who feel the fog rising in their mind, who their thinking gets obscured by the smoke or the ashes of Maya, then this sort of viveka is recommended by the seers. Take this up and cut away all of those things. So you can see Lord Vashishta says here to Sri Ram, whom we studied in a seminar last weekend, the appearance of the world, O Ram, is due to its being experienced through hundreds of births, devoid of yogic discrimination. The discriminating soul will pass beyond mere enjoyments then and secure these 3 great attainments: knowledge of truth, dissolution of the mind, and effacement of desires. So doesn't it seem like the Avatut got together with Lord Vashishta and started comparing notes here and saying basically the same things in their various different ways. Vashishta having to teach this young teenager, but the Avatut wanting to put out the whole Advaitic message as far as possible in 40 slokas, read the riot act on creation and on birth and death and things that we're imagining to be real. And my teacher used to say, the American people, you have hypnotized yourself into thinking you're a finite being. You're not finite, you're infinite. You're not matter, you're spirit, you're consciousness. So he was always encouraging us toward these Advaitic views. And if you had the wherewithal to dive deep and study non-duality with him or with rishis, and then that's going to impress that upon you like a great seal. You see, like the Mahamudra teaching in Tibetan Buddhism, it'll impress it upon the idea that consciousness is ever free, never bound. It's unborn, it's acreate, and so many other things that we're finding out here. So beautiful there. He talks about this. It reminds me of Vivekananda's beautiful verse of the Sannyasin, where he says, go thou from place to place and help them out of darkness, Maya's veils, beyond the fear of pain and the search for pleasure. Go beyond them both, you see. So pain and pleasure are one of these clouding, fogging, ash-leaving kinds of things in people's minds that then come right back up to this desires that haven't been effaced yet. You see. They're holding on to these desires, and then they're running you in cycles, he says, over hundreds of births. And His estimate is a lot less than some others I've read, hundreds and thousands or millions of births. So the soul's just popping up out of the mind, going back, just like babies by the hundreds and thousands are popping out from the womb and then going to dust, see, and then coming back again, without ever knowing the secret of it all, without ever knowing the underlying substrating, the foundation, Brahman, God, Allah, Buddha nature. Professional dreamers in a mass collective mental dream that's going on. Well, let's take these three quickly while we finish the last 10 minutes of this first class on the Gyanamritam Samarasam Chalisa of the Avadhut. You can see that Vishishta mentions those three great attainments: knowledge of truth, dissolution of the mind, and effacement of desires. I would say that's a good order to put them in, because a lot of people would say, well, I think I'll take away my desires. And they find out that's not so easy. And they find out that even if they can do it, if they have a particularly strong inclination towards being able to remove their desires, that they feel empty, like pulling out by the roots. Then you leave a space in the ground where the roots were. So what are you going to fill that in with, you see? So if you got the knowledge of the truth, that would take the water away from the plant of desire, and you'd start watering the tree, you see, and then all of this would lead to insights and revelations and realizations. So in this order, it's very good. What they mean by knowledge of truth: study of the scriptures is the means to the knowledge of truth. That's what we've been doing here for the last hour, taking you through 40 verses, 2 or 3 today, of the Avadhuta Gita. So you may go and get one. Here's one of them right here, Avadhuta Gita, and it's very small, you see, but it's power packed. Another one, I think it still looks like this. Swami Shokananda's looks like this one. So these are beautiful non-dual scriptures, Avadhuta Gita. The knowledge in there then will be a means to truth, to knowing truth for you. Dissolution of mind, the advice is practice of yoga is the means to dissolution of mind. So any of you have followed SRV through its 30 years or so, have known that with the Vedanta teachings, we've been teaching Patanjala yoga, 8-limbed yoga. And when people come and ask us for any other kind of a yoga, okay, well, then how about the 4 yogas? See, Jnanam, Vraja or Jnanam, and then Karma and Bhakti. How about those? So we're always, when the word yoga comes up, we're always turning you towards, pointing you towards, steering you towards this yoga that will help you dissolve the mind back to its source. Dissolution of the mind stream. We have a couple books here that you could, in SRV, that you can refer to actually meditate how to dissolve 5 elements into senses, those 10 into the inner senses, the inner tanmatras, those into the next level of subtle mind, and then those back into the causal level of things, Mahat, the great mind. So you're taking this gross mind and Stula Sharira, and then you're dissolving it into the Sukshma Sharira, subtle mind, and those two then get dissolved back into the Karna Sharira, the causal mind, the great mind. So it's like saying, cosmic, collective, and individual, isn't it? So this is a practice that beings like Vashishta way back have been recommending in order to escape this dream of hundreds of births you're having, based on the fact that you thought that creation was true, that you thought that birth was the thing to do, that you couldn't avoid dying again. had a fear of death. This father of this yoga says that you have a fear of death, and that brings you back towards birth. So you never resolve this round of birth and death, Kala Chakra. You never get off that cycle. And so the Abhidharma is saying it's all happening in your mind. The mind's in Brahman or in the Atman. Be more the witness, right? Witness consciousness. And so Vashishta is telling you, in his experience, study of the wisdom scriptures with a realized soul, plus practice of yoga, that soul, that is eight-limbed yoga or Raja Yoga, with the guidance of a luminary, a lumen guru, those two things are going to be what's most effective for getting yourself out of this state of bondage that you yourself have find yourself in. And then you get finally to these desires. It also is a nice order because we just mentioned Patanjali's yoga. He also says that these desires, and Kundalini talks about this too, these desires that are subtle, they go away very late in the game, like the gunas. Some of these things you think you've got these great attainments at hand, but you find out that you have karmas that are subtle, you have desires that are subtle, and you have the gunas that have a subtler form, like a subtler balance, a subtler restlessness, a subtler depression, that's still there in your mind, sort of like burnt ropes. It can't really bind you. Get a wind of grace and blow it away. So isn't that nirduma? Duma is the ashes, you just blow them away with a puff of wind from the grace that is inside of you, see, as the Atman, as consciousness. You must identify with your true self and disidentify with the false self. Beautiful teachings about that. Also coming up here about called the golden ego. And what's the golden ego? There's an ego that's pristine and beautiful, like Ishvara's ego. So that's one way of turning this small self toward the great self. And as you do, things get dissolved, right? And along the bhakti path. So your path of knowledge, path of bhakti, path of yoga, striving, all three of those, the mind is dissolving back to its source. And as it dissolves, its tendencies to be reborn again in ignorance dissolve with it. Because it's just like looking at the sun, you forget the light bulb and the candle. You keep your mind focused on that greater light. So the third one here, effacement of desires. Production of positive impressions is the means to effacement of latent impressions. Very classic samskara teaching by Lord Vashishta. Vashishta's yoga is another one of those great scriptures that he himself here just recommends that you can engage in and study. So here we've talked about Avadhuta Gita, which we're taking up together for the next series of Sundays. The Ashtavakra Samhita, which Ramakrishna loved very much and recommended as a revealed scripture, and now Yoga Vashishta, it's called. So those are great teachings that we value very highly, that give us this beautiful full yoga. So with time running out, or have run out already, we can probably pick up next week this chart, because we've seen the main meat of it here. If you take the sword of discrimination and strike away these bonds that bind you down, of shining gold or of darker baser ore, as Vivekananda has told us. This in accordance with this nirduma, ashes or fog or smoke, depending on which the commentator is using, and clear the mind, because from a clear mind, then you have a lot more opportunity for this divine essence, which is your true nature, to become revealed inside of you. Non-dual wisdom, ecstatic devotion, Holy Mother said, who has ever realized God without those? You see, those have to be a part of our daily practice, if you want to call it that way, or you could call it Advaita Vedanta sadhana, that there is a kind of very refined practice that the non-dualist engages in even after realization, just to keep the mind and its old tendencies from drifting back. Om. Jananim Sharanam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Pado Padme Toye Shritva Pranamami Mahor Mahor Pranamami Mahor Mahor. O Ramakrishna, teacher of all, O Sharada, goddess divine, in bosom holding those lotus feet, salutations to both ever be of mine.